I think, introduced the Golden Rule, and particularly looked at the two iterations of it as it appears in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. We talked a little bit about what rules are designed for. We talked and I guess came to some consensus about various things. Ultimately, in the case of moral rules, I think it's safe to say that they are designed to get our thinking and our behavior to a place that it would not naturally go to on our own. That these things are tools to make us more like our Creator and less like our own selfish desires. Being a rule, the Golden Rule is not any different than that. It's a tool to do that very thing. And I think where we ended last time was in saying that it's designed to guide us to the thinking behind the rule so that our thinking becomes manifest through our behaviors, and ultimately to guide us away from selfishness. As you wish that others would do to you is the lead or the foundation for this rule. When? As you wish that others would do to you, so do to them is the statement, but as you wish that others would do to you, when? And that's actually a more significant question than we might think. And I'll tell you that my understanding of this is that one of the fundamental ways that we can understand that is when we're in their position. When we are in their circumstances. To think about how we wish to be treated if we were in their shoes and then treat them that way. I'm not real sure that we always do a good job of applying it that way, though. We have to protect against what I believe is a very selfish interpretation that simply says, well, I like this, and so I'm going to do this. And ultimately, that is a position that only considers me, when in fact the whole point of the rule is to get us to consider them. And so the question of when Jesus is saying, as you wish that others would do for you, when that it applies to me when I am in their circumstances, not when I'm in my own. I don't think this should be looked at from our vantage point at all, but from the other person's vantage point. And this is very important. So, I have a series of relationships, situations that I want us to think about. And so when we think about applying the Golden Rule, as you wish that others would do to you, so do to them, when we are dealing, for instance, with a young person. And I don't care how you define young, by the way. If you're 80 and you think of someone who's 60 as being young, that's great. And if you're 20 and you think of someone that's 17 as being young, that's great. And if you're 50 and you think of anybody under the age of 30 as being young, that's great. Anytime you're dealing with someone that you look at from the perspective of this is a young individual, when you're dealing with the young, the question you have to ask is, if I were young in this relationship, if I was the one who was the younger, dealing with my elder, how would I wish to be treated? How would I wish to be respected? How would I wish to be listened to? And making application of that is difficult, especially when you're dealing with younger folks. Because let's be honest with ourselves, what do we believe about younger folks? It's okay, we can say it. They don't know anything. They're, and this has gotten a bad rap, this word has, but it's really not a bad word. They're ignorant. They just don't have knowledge. They haven't learned things yet. And so they don't understand anything, and I'm going to tell them what they need to do. Ask yourself the question, is that how you want someone to approach you, to come to you and tell you what you must do? Or would you rather them talk to you and listen to you and empathize with you and try to understand the situation that you're in and help enlighten you so that you can make your own choice? And that's a tough thing. It's a very tough thing. And so it's something that we have to think about. If I were female, how would I want men to treat me? How would I want to be respected? How would I want to be listened to? That's a question I think that every male needs to ask themselves when they interact with female folks. It's not I think this is right, so this is what I'm going to do to this person. It's wait a minute, if I was in the position of the weaker position, we'll say it that way. If I was the one who was more likely to be looked down upon, and let's be honest with ourselves, whether they ought to be or not, that's the way it often is. If I was in that situation, how would I want someone in my position to come to me and to interact with me and to speak to me and to listen to me if I were a minority? The same thing. The ability to empathize and put yourself in their position and understand how they feel, or at least try to understand. And a long way of making that happen is to actually listen to them rather than telling them things. And so if we're talking about any relationship at all, if I were in the weaker position, how would I want someone to show me respect? How would I want people to listen to me? How would I want people to speak to me? I have to ask those questions. What about this? If I were the offender, if I was the one who had caused offense to someone else, how would I want them to approach me when they came to me with the question? And they raised it with me. If I was the one that would I want them to be understanding? Would I want them to be patient? Would I want them to be as generous as possible with their interpretation of the circumstances? That's an interesting thing that really gives a lot of people trouble, but one of the things in our criminal court system that's required is that we view things in the best light of the accused. And so if there's a set of facts and there are two ways to look at them, our court system says we're going to look at it in the way that sheds the best light on the accused. Why? Because we want to protect the one who is being accused. It's the same thing here. If I were the one who had caused the offense, if I was the one who had stumbled, if I was the one who had done the wrong, how would I want them to approach me? How would I want them to speak to me about it? That's what this law, this rule is about. As you would have them do to you. If you were the offender, the way that you would want someone to approach you, that's the way you approach someone who's offended you. And yet, what do we do most of the time? Again, it's okay. We can just blurt it out. We all know. We rashly say things and make strong accusations. And more often than not, we assume the worst motives instead of the best. But we wouldn't want someone to do that with us. If they came to us like that, we would say, wait a minute, you're assuming my motive. Okay, if I understand that if I was in that situation, that's the way I would wish to be approached, that someone would come to me and say, instead of saying, you did this and I know why you did it. if I want them to come to me and say, why? Explain to me why you did this so I can understand. If that's how I want them to come to me, then that's really how I should go to other folks, right? That's what this golden rule is telling me. If I were a student, how would I want to be treated by my teacher? If I find myself in a situation where I'm the teacher, I probably ought to treat my students the way that I would hope that my teacher would treat me. Turn that around. If I were the teacher, how would I want my students to treat me? If I'm a student, that's the way I ought to approach that relationship. We ought to think about those things. If we're a citizen, and I think all of us can relate to this, how do we want the government to approach us? Now, here's where the rubber meets the road on this. From time to time, Christians find themselves in the position of being representatives of the government. And so, for instance, a Christian who is a police officer, how should he discharge his responsibilities? How should he treat the people he interacts with in the world? I'll tell you, exactly the same way that he would want a representative of the government to treat him. With respect and with the opportunity to be heard, with the opportunity to be listened to, not just the opportunity to speak, but the opportunity for the government to actually care about what you have to say. Okay, if I understand that, then when I find myself in that kind of a role, that's the way I need to discharge that responsibility. One that comes a little closer to home. If I were the employee, I find myself in a situation where I'm a supervisor at work or a manager of a business or maybe an owner. If I were the employee, in whatever exchange that's going on between the business owner or the manager and the employee, if I was the one who was in the weaker position, how would I want to be treated? That's how a good manager would treat his employees. By the way, that means that if you've ever been under someone's management and they have been abusive and dismissive and hadn't respected you and has taken advantage of you and you didn't like it, they just taught you a whole lot of ways of how not to treat other people when you get there yourself. So, you really want to make them mad, tell them thank you. When they treat you really, really poorly, say, you know, I know you didn't mean this for my good, but I appreciate what you've done for me because you just told me how I shouldn't act when I get in your position. And by the way, you can inverse this relationship if you're the employee. How do you approach your boss? Well, I'll tell you how you do it. Exactly the way you would want your employees to approach you if you were the boss. And so this rule has a lot to do with putting ourselves in the circumstances of the other party and then purposefully making decisions about how you're going to interact with them based upon what you would have them do to you if they were the doers. You notice about this rule is based on the assumption that I'm doing, right? As you would have others to do to you, do to them. This is my doing. So how do I do? Well, I'll tell you how I do. I do exactly the way I would want it to be done to me if the roles were reversed. Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a statement on that about the golden rule. whether you agree or not, or whether it's perception or not, was treating certain groups of people bad. Now those people seem to tend to have the power now, trying to force this critical theory on people now, to say that because of how you were born and where you was born, you are inherently evil. Because the golden rule wasn't applied in the first place, and that's not being applied again. And so what you're seeing now, because of the teachings of Christ, and nobody on either side, I'm talking about society.
Right. I know what you're talking about.
Is why we're in this mess we're on today, I believe. Because if the golden rule, if you wanted, if you treated people the way you wanted to from day one, up until now, but now these people that felt like they weren't treated right now are saying, well, guess what? You're the problem, and now we're going to throw these accusations against you because now they're not treating you the way that they wanted to be treated. So it's all wicked and evil now on both sides, and you got people now, because they didn't want to follow the teachings of Christ, at each other's throats because nobody wanted to follow the golden rule.
Right.
Everybody hates everybody now.
The bottom line is, we run by the rule, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Not, how would I treat the gander, or want the gander to be treated if I were the gander? See, what's good for the goose is good for the gander is what causes us to say, he hit me first, so it was okay for me to hit him. And it leads, ultimately, when you're dealing with human beings, to, I killed a man because he struck me. Because that's the way we are. We're not satisfied just with an eye for an eye. We want the other person's head if they take my eye. And that is why we are divided. And that is why hate rules. Because you remember where we started with this? We got to the golden rule by looking at the fact that everything's founded on you should love your neighbor as yourself. Right. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's where this arises from. And when we're not acting out of love, we're acting out of hate. And if we're not following the golden rule, we're not acting out of love, and therefore it inherently must be. Yep. Exactly. And if we go back again, I want to back up just a little bit and refresh our memory. When we go back to Leviticus 19, which is where the love your neighbor principle comes from, that Jesus draws so much off of. And you go back to Leviticus 19 and verse 17, you shall not hate your brother. The sentence doesn't stop there. The phrase doesn't even stop there. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. And so even back in Leviticus, when this is coming down to them as law, and we again so often say, I think, foolish things like, well, the law was a physical thing, and today we're under a spiritual law. Even that law, which did have a lot of physical elements to it in terms of sacrificing and all those other things, but even that law was really trying to get down to the heart of the matter, and to the people's hearts. And those physical rules that were the outcropping of that statement, you shall not hate your neighbor in your heart, were all of those rules that said, When you borrow, you have to do this, and when you lend, you have to do this, and you have to give back. And in the 7th year, when the Jubilee comes, you relieve all debts, and you don't reap your whole entire field. You leave the borders of it available so other people can glean from it. And all of those things were arising. They were rules that were arising out of that principle, don't hate your neighbor in your heart. And so, to go back to some practical application stuff that we experience day in and day out in everyday life, outside of the church building, when we're not always thinking about religion. We get ourselves in a situation where we are selling something to someone. The world will tell you this about selling something to someone. Let the market dictate what you can get for it and charge as much as you can. Yes?
When you were talking about maybe some that talk about the physical aspects of the law, but Paul in Romans 7 said the law is spiritual. And so he's, that's a hard case to make when Paul plainly says it is spiritual.
Right.
But yet, of course, as being physical, we're going to have, there's going to be a parallel between those two.
Sure. I mean, you know, if I'm selling something to someone, the mindset that I have to have is, how would I want to be treated if I were the buyer in this relationship? If I was the one making the purchase? I watched a show, I used to watch a show, I say it that way, I don't have the History Channel anymore, so I used to watch a show when I had the History Channel. And there was a lot of buying and selling in this show, and one of the things that amazed me about the people that were the focus of the show, they bought old, used things. Every once in a while they would buy something, and they would not really know what it was worth, and they would negotiate a price with someone, and they would leave, and when they left the situation, everybody was happy. That used to be how I defined a good deal, by the way. When both parties are satisfied, it's a good deal. I watched, and these were worldly people. These are not Christians. I watched them part company, and later on in the show, when they get down the road, they get something appraised, and they sell it, and they get a whole lot more money for it than they thought they were going to be able to get. What amazed me was these people would turn around and drive back and say, here, some of this is yours. You know why? Because they were thinking like buyers. Even when they were selling. And what they were doing by instinct, we should be doing because we understand that the people we are dealing with are created in God's image, whether they know it or not. And that they should be respected, and that they shouldn't be taken advantage of. And so if I'm selling something, I have to put myself in the buyer's shoes and say, how would I want the seller to treat me? And that's the way I sell. And by the way, the same thing as a buyer. These same people would do this as buyers. They would go in and they would say, well, how much you want for this? And the people would have no idea what they had, and they would spit out a price, and they would go, no, that's way too inexpensive. I'll give you this much. Now that's foolish business from a business school standpoint. You don't go into a negotiation and have an offer that's to your advantage and gives you more opportunity for profit, and you counteroffer by saying, no, let me pay you even more than what you're asking for. That's not what they teach you in business school. But that's what you do if you're thinking about the other party. And you're thinking about being fair and just and honorable. And that's how the golden rule applies in everyday life.
Mike, can I add something?
Yes.
I think that's a great point. In the context I'm looking at in Luke, it goes even deeper than that. To people that don't treat you right in the business trade. if they don't treat you right, that don't give you the right not to do back to them because of 31, 32, and all the way down.
That's-
He's talking about what good is it if you do what you just said. Even sin is, I mean, you know, that's easy. But he said the heart of the golden rule, the meat of it is, you got to do that to the people you don't want to have to do it to.
Exactly.
That mistreated you.
Even the people who would not do it to you, you do it to them anyway. Even the people who have taken advantage of you, you don't take advantage of them. Listen, that's hard to do because we live in a time that tells us what? You give what you get. If you treat me disrespectful, then I'm going to treat you disrespectful. You have to earn your respect. I would suggest to you that every human being earns a certain level of respect simply because they're human, created in the image of God. And that respect is theirs regardless of how they live their life. All right, I got one back there, and then I got one here, and did you? Okay. Right.
I don't know if you recall, if you ever watched that show, Pawn Shop. In that, several times, people would come in to sell something, and they would say, I'm looking for it. They'd tell them, "Is it money?"
Let me teach you what you got.
He would say, no, it's worth much more than that.
Right.
But anyway, that makes you feel good about him.
It does.
There was a story I heard about, I think he was a priest in Los Angeles who took in these gang members and gave them jobs and stuff. But he said something that I think is the golden rule. When people asked him, the interviewer asked him, aren't you afraid these people take advantage of you? Aren't you? He says, no. And the guy said, well, why not? He says, because I gave my advantage away. And nobody can take advantage of you if they mistreat you like this guy was trying to insinuate. The priest or whoever he was saying that, look, by what I'm doing, they can't take advantage of me because I gave it away. And that's the same thing with the golden rule. If you more worried about people taking advantage of you and you're looking weak and you're looking, well, they're going to take advantage of you, then you're missing out on the golden rule.
Right.
Because you want to treat them not the way they're treating you. And if you're worried about being taken advantage of, you're not going to treat them the way the Bible says you should, because you're going to be on guard and you're going to be looking for something to counteract.
Right. And I'm not going to speak for that gentleman, but I think what he means by I gave it away is this. I'm not being taken advantage of because I understand what they're doing. I'm not trying to stop what they're doing. That's all I'm doing, is I'm not trying to stop them from abusing me because I choose not to. And I'm not going to turn around and be abusive back to them because I choose not to be. Hopefully, we do that not because we're afraid, but hopefully we do that because we love our neighbor as ourselves. Find yourself, we've got people among us that are nurses. We've had doctors that worship with us. We had a psychiatrist that worshiped with us for a while. If I were the patient, how would I want to be treated? How would I want to be respected? How would I want to be listened to? You ever had a doctor that walked into the room and just didn't listen to a word you told him? Remember how that made you feel? Okay, you may not ever be the doctor, but you will at some point be in the position that the doctor is in. You'll be a parent. You'll be a teacher. You'll be the one who is the doer. And you need to remember, wait a minute, it made me feel terrible when I wasn't listened to. So before I do, let me ask. Now, it's hard. It's hard to do this. It's hard to remember to do it. It's really hard to do it when you're in a hurry. You just want to get it done and be done with it? But we have to be more thoughtful than that. If you are the customer, if you find yourself in a job where you're a salesperson in a department store, or working in a restaurant, or many other service jobs that are out there, if you were the customer, how would you want to be treated? I've been in a lot of restaurants and been waited on by a lot of people, and I promise you, they were not thinking about what they would want if they were sitting at the table. They were thinking about themselves and what they would rather be doing than where they were at. And it showed in the way that they spoke to me, in the way that they treated me, and in that it took me 25 minutes to get my water glass refilled. Anytime that we engage in any of these things, the question is, if I was the other party, how would I wish to be treated? That is what directs my action. Now, this is not easy to accomplish. First off, it takes very thoughtful and purposeful action on my part. I have to be thinking about it. I have to be putting myself in their shoes and trying to determine what I would think would be fair and just and right in those circumstances. And that's not easy to do. It becomes inherently difficult if there's really no way that you can ever find yourself in those specific situations. Every parent in the room I'm fixing to shame, me included. I promise you there was a day when you were a kid that you were extremely angry about what your parents were doing, and you said, when I have children, I will never do that to them. And then you became a parent and you did it to them. And maybe, luckily, every once in a while, you caught yourself going, oh, wait a minute. This is one of those things I said I would never do. Try to remember. Try to remember. And try to realize that you can cross over and learn from other situations and apply it to another situation. See, I will never know what it's like to be female. It's not going to happen. I have no way to relate to what it's like to walk through this world and be female and have people make assumptions about you that there is absolutely no basis for them to make, like you're not as smart, or you can't do this, or... But I have been in situations where people made assumptions about me and treated me that way. Not because I was female, but because I was young or because I was unknown. It's amazing how differently you get treated when people think you're important. All they have to do is think you're important. You don't have to be important. They just have to believe that you are. When I walk through a store with a coat and tie on, I get treated different. True story. I will not out the business. This is a true story. There is a business in this town that when I do business with them, they carry my goods out to my car for me. Every time I've been in there, that has been the constant treatment. When my wife walked into the same place, they did not do that for her. That is exactly the opposite of what you think ought to happen. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time that I was in there, I was in a coat and tie. And they probably thought I was important. Little did they know. That kind of stuff attaches to all of us. The world that we live in creeps in on our behavior. And we hear it and we see it day after day after day after day, and we eventually make the mistake of thinking, you know what, if that's what they're going to do to me, then that's what they're getting back. That is not what the Golden Rule says. The golden rule says, regardless of what they do, you treat them the way you would like to be treated if you were them. And that is an extremely difficult thing. So let's get real, and let's get to a situation that I think everyone in this room and probably everyone that is watching online right now is likely to find themselves in the position of, if you're dealing with someone who you believe is about to make a spiritual mistake, they are about to cross that line in sin, they are about to do something that is the beginning of the path to sin, and you're concerned and you're worried about them, and you need to go to them. How do you do that? I'll tell you how. You put yourself in that position. If it was me, if I was the one that was about to make a spiritual mistake, how would I want to be approached? I can tell you it wouldn't be by someone berating me or yelling at me or mistreating me in any way. I would want them to come to me out of care and concern, trying to understand my circumstances, trying to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, trying to understand so they can be better positioned to help me see for myself that it's not the direction I want to go. And so if I understand that, then I do that. When I see someone who is about to make or has just made. And that's what the Bible's talking about when it says to go to one and in a spirit of gentleness restore them. And there's no end to this list. There's literally no end to this list. Every single relationship that we have, every single interaction that we have, every time we speak to another person, we have to be trying to think about, how would I wish to be spoken to in these circumstances? Have you ever been in a situation where someone talks down to you and assumes that you don't understand what you're doing or what's going on? It's really fun when that happens, when you actually know more about the subject than the person who's correcting you. You know what the greatest demonstration of understanding this is that even in that situation, you're very gentle. And you say, thank you. Thank you for your concern. Do they have to know that you know more than them? We had somebody shake their head no, and that's the true answer. That is the true answer. But listen, it's not always the answer that I have at that moment. At that moment, very often, I have to prove something. What do I have to prove? That I know what I'm doing, and I know more than you. And that is when I am falling prey to being selfish, seeking recognition, seeking to elevate and exalt myself, when I just have to prove to you that I know more than you. It doesn't matter if they ever know. Yes, sir.
This is a little bit different direction. It's important trail that you're on there, so I don't want to distract too much. But in just this whole talking about love, I think it's probably the most important way that we let our light shine to the world, because in all the ways you can do good, are you doing it right? Not everybody sees it, but it's the human interactions to where this
Which is why Matthew 7:12 says what it does. So, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Everything else hinges on demonstrating that you love God and that you love your neighbor as yourself. What did Jesus say about that? Upon those two things, hang the whole law. Yes, sir.
Neighbor doesn't mean what we think it means today. I think that's important. We don't realize our neighbors aren't just our friends. According to the scriptures, the neighbor, if you look at the Samaritan, it could be your enemy is your neighbor as well. So I think
Well, yeah, and we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, but since I brought it up, I'll mention it real quickly. This is going back to Leviticus 19, after he says, you shall not hate your brother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In verse 18, he says in verse 34, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. And so the fact of the matter is, anybody that's around, whether you know them or not, that's your neighbor. But let's be realistic. We treat people we know differently than we treat people we don't know, right? And you know what that tells me? We all have work to do. We all have work to do. Got to stop. I've probably gone over anyway. Thanks for your participation and your presence tonight.